Hey there! This video is part of a video lecture series by Project Pustakalaya, a non-profit initiative that aims to expand access to education for learners across ages. Today we'll be covering Psychology 101, specifically the foundations of psychology. So, to begin with, what exactly is psychology? Now, the most common definition that you're probably going to find anywhere is that it's the scientific study of the mind. But if you look at this definition a little longer, you'll soon realize it's not exactly very helpful. Because what exactly is the mind? And keep that question in mind because that's one that this video lecture series explores throughout. And something that this specific video will get into as well as we look at the views that different psychologists throughout history have had on what the mind is and therefore what psychology is. Today, we will be looking at major historical figures in psychology. We begin with Wilhelm Wundt. Now, he's notable because he founded the first ever psychology laboratory. And keep in mind, this video is going to be about a lot of firsts in psychology. So, the first that you need to remember for Wilhelm Wundt is the first psychology laboratory. Now, before he did this, psychology was considered a sort of philosophy. It was only after that he began conducting experiments in his laboratory that psychology became more of a branch of science. Now, the way he did this was by using something called introspection, which we'll get to in just a moment. And that was by founding a school of thought that he called structuralism. So let's get into that. Now, structuralism was the process of studying the mind by studying its parts. Now, people who believed in structuralism were the structuralists. And what they believed was that an object could be studied by observing the parts and materials that it's made of. Now, if you apply this to a different context, a structuralist, if they had to study a car, would break it apart, would disassemble it, and study the individual parts, such as the steering wheel and the tires and the engine. And it was then after studying all those parts that they would come to a conclusion as to what it is that this object actually does and what's the purpose that it serves. The way they did this was not by mechanically disassembling cars, it was through introspection. So introspection was the process of looking inward and observing yourself. So it was basically a way for structuralists to get to know how a person was thinking and how they were processing and interpreting information. But this was a very flawed method because you can't both learn psychology and observe yourself learning psychology at the same time, because we cannot as humans multitask. So it was very hard for people to report what they were thinking and the way that they were thinking it at the same time as them thinking it. So we had another school of thought, and this was founded by William James. He came up with the idea of functionalism, which we'll explore in just a moment. But two other things you need to know about him is that he wrote the first ever psychology textbook, and second, that he paved the way for women in psychology. And we'll delve deeper into that later in this video as well. So, functionalism. Now, functionalists, people who believed in functionalism, looked at objects by studying the function and the purpose that these objects served. And that's the way they wanted to look at the mind as well. Let's apply the same car analogy. If a functionist had to study a car, they would get inside the car, turn it on, drive it, and then observe how it works. So, this school of thought was sort of a branch of evolutionary science. If you know about Charles Darwin, you know that he believed that every trait survived because it helped the organism. Functionalists believe something like that. They believe that every object, every trait served a purpose that aided survival, and that's why the best way to understand what an object, or in this case the mind, did was by studying the function that it served. We do still have more schools of thought, however. We had Max Wertheimer, who founded something called Gestalt psychology. Now, if the word Gestalt sounds like something very unfamiliar and you've probably never heard it, don't worry because it's actually German. And Gestalt means whole in German. And that explains very well actually what Gestalt psychology is, which we'll get to in a second. But Max Wertheimer came up with this sort of psychology as a way of opposing the fundamental ideas of what structuralism stood for. So let's look at Gestalt psychology, right? So Gestalt psychology was about studying the mind as something that's worth more than the sum of its parts. Now, do you see how Gestalt psychologists and structuralists were always at clash with each other? Because Gestalt psychology believed that you cannot study an object by simply observing its parts because it's worth more than those individual parts. But that was exactly what the structuralists did not want to do. They wanted to look at objects just by the parts they were made of. They did not think of looking at it as more than what the parts actually constituted. But we have two images here for you to really understand how Gestalt psychology functioned. So look at the image on the left. Do you see two faces or do you see a vase? Take a look at it for a second. Now, if you see two faces, that's correct. But if you see a vase, you're also correct. That's because your mind perceives differently what it considers the whole. In my case, I see the two faces staring at each other first. It takes me some time, but I also notice the vase. You may have to take some time to notice the two faces, but maybe it's the vase that jumps out to you instantly. Now look at the second image. What do we see? We have triangles and circles, right? Well, not exactly, because there's actually not a single triangle here. We do not even have circles. This is just a bunch of lines that have been pieced together in a way to make you think that they are triangles. Why does this happen? Because your mind actually tries to fill in the gaps that it sees. So instead of the places where there actually are no lines, it fills in the gap for you to actually see a triangle there or to actually see a circle. So do you see how your mind sees it as more than just what it is made of? Your mind does not see those individual lines. Your mind looks at it as sort of a different whole. That's just a teaser into what Gestalt psychology is, because we will get deeper into it in later videos. But we're switching gears now, because it wasn't only bearded men, in fact, who defined psychology. There were also some important women you should know about. Mary Woodin Calkins is the first. So, very importantly, she was the first female president of the American Psychological Association. And the American Psychological Association is basically the most important body dealing with research in psychology. And it deals with things like ethical guidelines, experiments in psychology, and things like that. Now, Mary Whiton Calkins is also important because she studied and researched memory extensively. And the last thing we need to know about her, that she was in fact a student of William James. And fun story actually, which I'd encourage you to look up sometime, is Mary Whiton Calkins was almost the first female to get a PhD in psychology. Almost, but not exactly. So look up that story sometime if you have free time. Lastly, then we look at Margaret Floy Washburn, and she did, in fact, become the first female to have a PhD in psychology. She was also the second female president of the American Psychological Association. Wow. That brings us to the end of our first video in this video lecture series. We covered a lot of different people today, a lot of new terms. This video is there for you to review anytime. In our next video, we'll be looking at major theoretical approaches in psychology, some of whom came from the psychologists we discussed in this very video. See you next time.